glove. That's what connected 15 men to the biggest robbery in British history. Not the £2.6 million in used banknotes. Not the Koshes or the balaclavas or the 2 locomotives. A glove with a palm print that shouldn't have been there. Because the man who left it had been specifically told to wear gloves the entire time. August 8, 1963, 3:03 a.m. A 16-car mail train was stopped at a red signal on a remote stretch of track in Buckinghamshire, and in the next 45 minutes, a crew of 15 men would execute what investigators would call the crime of the century. But the remarkable thing about the Great Train Robbery wasn't the precision or the planning or even the audacity of stopping a moving train in the middle of the night. It was that most of the men who did it had never committed a crime this ambitious in their lives. They were small-time operators promoted far beyond their experience, led by a mastermind who understood logistics but fatally underestimated human nature. And the story of how they got caught reveals less about sophisticated police work than it does about the gap between criminal ambition and criminal competence. The architect of the robbery was a man named Bruce Reynolds, 31 years old in the summer of 1963, running an antique shop in South London that barely concealed what he actually did for a living. Reynolds had spent the previous decade orchestrating mid-level robberies, truck hijackings, warehouse jobs, nothing that made headlines but enough to fund a lifestyle that attracted attention, Jaguars and tailored suits and holiday homes on the Mediterranean coast. He saw himself as a gentleman thief, someone who studied his targets the way a businessman studies markets, and according to associates who knew him then, he genuinely believed there was a professional way to commit crime. The London underworld Reynolds operated in had a specific hierarchy: old-school criminals at the top who'd built reputations during wartime black markets, then a middle tier of specialists, safecrackers, and drivers and fences, and at the bottom, a large pool of casual thieves who'd take any job that paid. Reynolds understood that pulling off something unprecedented meant recruiting from that bottom tier, men who wouldn't ask too many questions and couldn't afford to turn down a significant payday. But it also meant working with people who'd never operated at this scale. The opportunity came to Reynolds in early 1963 through a contact known only as the Ulsterman, someone with detailed knowledge of the overnight mail trains running from Glasgow to London, and specifically of one train that carried used banknotes being returned to London for destruction. The train ran 5 nights a week, Sundays through Thursdays, and the second car behind the diesel locomotive was designated the high-value package coach, an armoured sorting car where postal workers process registered mail and secure packages during the 7-hour journey south. The high-value package coach had reinforced sides, small windows covered with metal grills, and a door that locked from the inside, with 5 postal workers assigned to the car. And during peak periods, the haul could reach £3 million in used currency, cash that was already written off in bank ledgers and wouldn't be missed until it failed to arrive for incineration. What made it attractive to Reynolds wasn't just the money, but the vulnerability. A moving train on a predictable schedule passing through rural areas with minimal police presence, and the fact that railway security in 1963 operated on the assumption that no one would be brazen enough to actually stop a train. But stopping a diesel locomotive pulling 16 cars traveling at 70 miles per hour required specific knowledge, technical expertise that Reynolds didn't possess. And so, he began recruiting the crew based not on criminal experience, but on a more fundamental question: who do you know who might understand trains? The answer was Roger Cordray, 43 years old, a florist from Brighton with no criminal record, but a background as a railway signalman during the Second World War. And according to later court testimony, Caudry was the one who explained how to manipulate the colour light signals. The colour light system used on British railways employed a three-aspect setup: green for clear track ahead, yellow for caution, red for stop, and the lights were powered by low-voltage circuits that could be interrupted with simple tools, a battery and some wire being sufficient to change a signal from green to red. Caudry's innovation was covering the green light with a glove and powering the red light with a 6-volt battery, creating a full stop signal that would force the driver to halt while leaving the actual signal system intact, a method that revealed both technical understanding and a crucial misunderstanding of railway protocol. Because Caudry had assumed that a driver seeing a red signal on a clear stretch of track would simply stop and investigate, but British railway procedure required drivers to use a trackside telephone to call the signal box and confirm the stop, a safeguard designed to prevent exactly this kind of interference. Reynolds began assembling the crew in May of 1963, reaching out to associates with different skill sets, and the roster that emerged reads less like a gang of professional criminals and more like a desperate attempt to cover all possible contingencies with whoever was available. There was Buster Edwards, a 32-year-old club owner and small-time thief who'd never done hard time. Brought in because Reynolds trusted him and needed bodies, and Edwards would later describe himself as being out of his depth from the beginning, but unwilling to walk away from a potential £50,000 share. Gordon Goody, a 33-year-old hairdresser with a reputation for violence and previous convictions for robbery, recruited as the enforcer who would handle any resistance from the train crew, though later testimony suggests he was deeply uncomfortable with the possibility of actually hurting anyone. Charlie Wilson, a 31-year-old bookmaker from Clapham, brought in to manage the money and logistics, described by associates as methodical and careful, someone who'd built a successful illegal betting operation through attention to detail rather than boldness. And then there was Ronnie Biggs, 33 years old, a carpenter with a minor criminal record, recruited specifically because Reynolds needed a train driver, and Biggs claimed to know someone who could drive a diesel locomotive, a claim that would prove to be catastrophically optimistic. The driver Biggs produced was a man whose name has never been officially confirmed, described in court documents only as a retired railway employee who agreed to move the train after it was stopped. But when the crew assembled for a practice run in late July, it became clear this man had never operated a diesel locomotive in his life. He'd driven steam engines, an entirely different technology with different controls and operating principles, and after 20 minutes of attempting to move the practice locomotive, Reynolds and the crew realized they'd have to improvise, which meant physically dragging the train driver from the high-value package coach and forcing him to move the train themselves. This created a fundamental problem that Reynolds either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. They'd gone from a plan that involved no direct contact with victims to one that required physically assaulting a train driver and threatening postal workers, an escalation that transformed the crime from theft to violent robbery. For most of the crew, the motivation was straightforward and economic. These were working-class men in their 30s with families and debts and limited prospects, and £50,000 represented more money than they'd earn in 10 years of legitimate work, a transformative amount that justified enormous risk. But Reynolds operated from a different psychology entirely. He already had money and success in his limited world, and multiple crew members would later suggest that what drove him was the challenge itself, the desire to prove that an impossible crime was actually achievable with proper planning. By early August, they'd settled on a date, Thursday, August 8th, specifically chosen because it followed a bank holiday weekend when the high-value package coach would carry maximum currency, and the location, a stretch of track near Brodego Bridge in Buckinghamshire, chosen because it offered isolation and road access in equal measure. The crew needed a secure location to hide after the robbery, somewhere isolated enough that 15 men and multiple vehicles wouldn't attract attention, and they found it in Leatherslade Farm, a derelict property 27 miles from the robbery site, rented through an intermediary for £500 cash. The farm represented different things to different crew members. For Reynolds, it was a tactical staging ground. For the others, it became something closer to a trap, a place they'd be confined together for days with millions in cash and growing paranoia about who might talk. In the days leading up to August 8th, the crew made multiple trips to the farm, stockpiling food and supplies, painting one of the stolen vehicles military green to resemble an army lorry, rehearsing the signal manipulation, and attempting to address the driver problem that still hadn't been solved. Multiple crew members would later describe the atmosphere at the farm on August 7th as increasingly tense. Men who'd been confident weeks earlier now confronting the reality of what they were about to attempt, and the realization that the violence they dismissed as unlikely was now inevitable. August 7th, 11 p.m. 15 men, 3 vehicles. They left Leatherslade Farm in darkness, driving convoy-style toward Brodego Bridge, and according to later statements, almost no one spoke during the 40-minute journey. They arrived at the signal location at 11:45 p.m., and Caudray went to work immediately, covering the green aspect with a glove, connecting his battery to the red light, creating the full stop signal that would halt the train in approximately 3 hours. What followed was a waiting period that multiple crew members described as the worst part of the entire operation. 3 hours in the dark near the railway embankment, unable to smoke or make noise, watching for police patrols or railway workers who might spot them. Buster Edwards later recalled spending those hours convinced the plan would fail, that police would arrive or the train wouldn't stop, or something unexpected would derail everything, while others grew increasingly agitated by the forced silence and the weight of what they were about to do. 2:58 a.m. The Glasgow mail train approached Sears Crossing, travelling at approximately 70 miles per hour. Driver Jack Mills saw the yellow caution signal, then the red. He began braking. 3:03 a.m. The train stopped at Brodego Bridge, exactly where Reynolds had planned. Mills's fireman, David Whitby, climbed down to use the trackside telephone. It had been disconnected. As Whitby walked back toward the locomotive, figures emerged from the darkness, men in balaclavas moving quickly toward the train. And in that moment, the carefully planned robbery became something messier and more desperate than Reynolds had envisioned. What happened next remains disputed in witness accounts, but the essential facts are these. Jack Mills was struck on the head with a weapon, possibly a kosh or metal bar, receiving injuries that would leave him with lasting trauma. And the violence was neither planned nor controlled, but rather a panicked reaction by men who'd never assaulted anyone before. Gordon Goody, recruited specifically as the enforcer, later claimed he wasn't the one who struck Mills, and that the assault violated the agreement that no one would be seriously hurt. A statement that reveals the crew's fundamental misunderstanding of how violence works once initiated. With Mills injured and barely conscious, the crew faced the driver problem they'd never solved. They needed to move the train approximately half a mile to the unloading point at Brodego Bridge, and the retired steam driver they'd brought couldn't operate the diesel controls. They forced the injured Mills to move the train himself, Whitby assisting under threat. and the locomotive lurched forward in stops and starts, Mills barely able to focus, the crew screaming instructions they didn't understand, turning what should have been a 2-minute movement into a chaotic 15-minute ordeal. At the unloading point, the crew uncoupled the front 2 cars from the rest of the train, isolating the high-value package coach, and they began attacking the reinforced door with crowbars and hammers, discovering that the postal workers inside had barricaded themselves and were refusing to open. The 5 postal workers inside the coach had heard the commotion and Mills shouting, and they'd made the decision to resist, piling mail bags against the door and preparing to defend themselves with whatever tools they had. A moment of courage that forced the robbers to escalate again. The crew threatened to use explosives, almost certainly a bluff given that they had none, but the threat worked. The postal workers opened the door at approximately 3:25 a.m., 22 minutes after the train had stopped, and the loading phase began. 120 mail bags, each bag searched by hand, high-value packages isolated, approximately £2.6 million in used notes, 30 minutes to load everything into the waiting lorry. The loading phase revealed the hierarchy within the crew, Reynolds and Wilson directing operations while others formed a human chain, passing bags from the coach to the lorry, and several members later described this as the moment they realized the scale of what they'd stolen exceeded anything they'd imagined. Before leaving, they handcuffed the postal workers and train crew together, a delay tactic that bought them approximately 30 additional minutes, because once freed, the crew would need to walk to a phone or wait for another train, and those minutes represented the difference between escape and capture. 3:55 a.m. The convoy left Bridego Bridge, 3 vehicles loaded with cash and 15 men who'd just committed the largest robbery in British history. They reached Leatherslade Farm at 4:30 a.m. Back at the farm, the crew unloaded the mail bags and began the counting process, discovering that their haul was even larger than expected. But the euphoria lasted only hours before reality set in. They were trapped in an isolated farmhouse with millions in stolen currency and no clear plan for what came next. Multiple crew members described the days immediately following the robbery as psychologically devastating. The initial excitement replaced by paranoia, arguments about dividing the money, growing fear that police were closing in, and the dawning realization that spending millions in stolen notes would be nearly impossible. 4:26 a.m. August 8th, train crew freed themselves. 5:15 a.m. police notified. 6 a.m. detectives arrived at Bridego Bridge. The investigation began immediately. The robbery's scale triggered an unprecedented police response. Scotland Yard assembled a special investigation team. Fingerprint experts examined every surface on the train, and detectives began canvassing rural Buckinghamshire for reports of unusual vehicle movements or large groups of men. News of the robbery dominated British media within hours. The audacity and scale captured public imagination in ways that disturbed authorities, and there was uncomfortable evidence that portions of the public viewed the robbers as folk heroes, rather than violent criminals who'd assaulted an innocent train driver. Jack Mills's injuries proved more serious than initially reported. He suffered head trauma that caused ongoing health problems, and he never fully recovered or returned to railway work, a human cost largely ignored in the romanticized narratives that emerged around the robbery. At Leatherslade Farm, Reynolds made the decision that would ultimately doom the entire crew. Rather than immediately abandoning the farm and dispersing, he kept everyone together for days, believing they needed to wait for the initial police sweep to pass before moving. A catastrophic misreading of how modern investigations work. Reynolds had arranged for someone to come clean the farm after they left, eliminating fingerprints and evidence, but this person either never arrived or did an extraordinarily poor job. And when police discovered Leatherslade Farm on August 13th, it was a forensic gold mine. A local herdsman named John Morris noticed activity at the supposedly abandoned farm and reported it to police. And when detectives arrived on August 13th, they found sleeping bags, food supplies, recently used cooking equipment, and most critically, fingerprints on nearly every surface that the cleanup crew had failed to eliminate. Among the evidence found at the farm was a monopoly board the crew had used to count and divide the money, and it was covered in fingerprints, including prints from crew members who had specifically been warned to keep gloves on at all times. The glove metaphor from the opening now revealed as systematic carelessness. Fingerprint analysis identified Roger Caudry within days, his prints on a paint can and multiple other surfaces, and the identification triggered a cascade of arrests as detectives matched additional prints to known criminals in their database. The crew's lack of forensic awareness proving catastrophic. Roger Caudry was arrested on August 14th in Bournemouth, with a significant portion of his share of the money, and his capture demonstrated another fatal flaw in the crew's planning. They'd stolen more cash than they could practically hide or spend, and moving large amounts of used currency immediately attracted attention. The crew members responded to the investigation pressure in revealing ways. Some immediately fled the country, others stayed and attempted to establish alibis, and a few simply waited at home, either paralyzed by fear or convinced they'd left no evidence, each response illuminating different aspects of criminal psychology under extreme stress. The investigation unfolded under intense media scrutiny. Newspapers published photos of the arrested men, ran features on their backgrounds and families, and the public attention created additional pressure on those still at large, making anonymous hiding increasingly difficult. Charlie Wilson was arrested on August 22nd at his home in Clapham. Detectives finding £12,000 hidden in a briefcase, a fraction of his share but enough to establish possession, and Wilson's methodical nature that had served him well in bookmaking completely failed him in crisis management. Gordon Goody was arrested in early September, and unlike the others who maintained silence or offered denials, Goody attempted to craft elaborate explanations for his fingerprints and whereabouts, his amateur attempts at counter-investigation revealing someone who'd watched too many crime films and understood too little about forensic science. Buster Edwards fled to Mexico with his wife and daughter, living on his share of the robbery for several months. But the psychological toll of exile and separation from familiar life proved unbearable, and he would eventually return to face arrest, choosing punishment over permanent displacement. Ronnie Biggs was arrested in September, and his role demonstrates the arbitrary nature of criminal fame. He was a minor participant recruited only because he claimed to know a train driver, yet he would become the robbery's most famous figure due to what happened next. By the end of September, police had arrested 12 of the 15 crew members and recovered approximately £400,000, less than 20% of the total haul, and the missing money created its own mythology. Rumors of buried caches and secret accounts that investigators would chase for decades. The identity of the Ulsterman, the insider who provided information about the mail train schedule and cargo, was never definitively established. Investigators developed theories and suspects, but no conclusive evidence. And this figure remains the robbery's great unresolved question. The trial began in January 1964 at Aylesbury Assizes. 12 defendants facing charges of robbery with violence, conspiracy, and receiving stolen goods, and the prosecution's case relied heavily on the fingerprint evidence from Leatherslade Farm physical proof that demolished every alibi. The trial attracted enormous public and media attention. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily, and the defendants were treated by some observers as celebrities rather than criminals, a cultural response that deeply troubled authorities and revealed complex public attitudes towards certain types of crime. Jack Mills testified about the assault and his ongoing health problems. His appearance intended to counter the romantic narrative surrounding the robbery, and his testimony revealed the human cost that celebratory media coverage had largely ignored. March 26, 1964. Judge Edmund Davies delivered sentences, 30 years, for 7 of the defendants, the harshest sentences for non-violent robbery in British legal history. The sentences sparked immediate controversy. Legal experts argued they were disproportionate compared to sentences for more violent crimes, while others defended them as necessary deterrents, and the debate revealed fundamental questions about how societies value different types of harm. In July 1965, Ronnie Biggs escaped from Wandsworth Prison using a rope ladder, fled to Paris for plastic surgery, then to Australia and eventually Brazil, and his decades-long exile and eventual return in 2001 transformed him from minor participant to the robbery's public face. Charlie Wilson also escaped from prison in 1964, breaking out of Winson Green with outside help, and he remained free for 4 years before being recaptured in Canada. His brief freedom demonstrating that even successful escape couldn't provide lasting relief from the robbery's consequences. The robbery's aftermath stretched across decades. Crew members served varying portions of their sentences. Some were released and lived quietly. Others struggled with the notoriety. And the stolen money's disappearance generated conspiracy theories and treasure hunting that continues today. Jack Mills died in 1970 at age 64, his family maintaining that the assault and its aftermath contributed to his early death. And while the direct medical causation remained disputed, the robbery's human cost was never simply financial. The Great Train Robbery entered British cultural mythology in ways that complicated simple moral lessons. Films and books portrayed the robbers sympathetically, their working-class backgrounds and daring execution overshadowing the violence and victims in popular memory. What the robbery ultimately revealed wasn't the viability of careful planning or the romance of audacious crime, but rather the opposite, that even a meticulously planned operation fell apart through human error, that stolen money provided no lasting satisfaction, and that the gap between criminal ambition and criminal competence was wider than anyone involved had understood. Bruce Reynolds evaded capture until 1968, living in Mexico and Canada, but eventually returned to Britain and served 10 years. And after release, he struggled financially, the millions he'd stolen providing no lasting security, eventually dying in relative poverty in 2013. The robbery prompted immediate changes in railway security. Mail train procedures were revised, cash transportation methods evolved, and the crime demonstrated vulnerabilities in systems that had operated on assumptions of impossibility rather than robust security design. The question of who struck Jack Mills was never definitively answered. Multiple crew members denied responsibility. Others suggested it was someone who fled and was never caught. And this unresolved question haunts the robbery's legacy, the one act of violence remaining mysteriously unattributed. Of the £2.6 million stolen, approximately £2 million was never recovered, and while some was certainly spent over the years, investigators continue to believe significant amounts remain hidden, buried or stashed by crew members who died before revealing their locations. A glove used to cover a railway signal, removed for just a moment, and a palm print left on a Monopoly board. These weren't sophisticated criminals undone by brilliant police work. They were ordinary men who attempted something extraordinary. And they succeeded for exactly 5 days before their own carelessness, their inability to follow the simplest precautions, guaranteed their capture. The Great Train Robbery wasn't defeated by impregnable security or impossible obstacles. It was defeated by human nature, by the gap between what people imagine they can do and what they're actually capable of maintaining under pressure. And that's where we'll leave it. Thanks for listening and diving into this incredible story. If you enjoyed this story and want more documentaries like this, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And see you in the next one.